The Enfield Poltergeist. Prologue. The weight of silence in the autumn of 1977. The suburban streets of Enfield, North London, bore witness to events that would challenge the very foundations of rational thought. What began as subtle disturbances in a modest council house on Green Street would evolve into one of the most documented and controversial cases of alleged paranormal activity in British history. The Enfield Poltergeist, as it came to be known, would transform the lives of the Hodgson family forever and divide the scientific community between believers and skeptics for decades to come. The story that unfolded within the walls of 284 Green Street was not merely one of supernatural terror, but a complex tapestry of human psychology, family dynamics, and the eternal struggle between faith and reason. It was a tale that would attract the attention of paranormal investigators, journalists, and curious onlookers from around the world, all seeking to understand the inexplicable phenomena that seemed to center around an 11-year-old girl named Janet Hodgson. Chapter 1. The ordinary beginning. Green Street in Enfield was the embodiment of post-war British suburban aspirations. Rows of identical council houses stretched along the quiet road, their small front gardens carefully tended by residents who had found modest prosperity in the rebuilding years following the Second World War. The neighborhood was populated by working-class families, their children playing in the streets, while mothers hung washing on lines strung between identical back gardens. Number 284 stood no different from its neighbors. A 3-bedroom semi-detached house built in the 1930s as part of a housing estate designed to provide affordable homes for London's growing population. The red brick facade, small bay window, and narrow front path were replicated dozens of times along the street, creating a uniformity that was both comforting and suffocating in its predictability. Peggy Hodgson had moved into the house in 1966, with her husband Ronald and their 4 children, Margaret, aged 13, Janet, 11, Johnny, 10, and Billy, 7. The family represented the archetypal British working-class household of the era, with Ronald employed as a labourer and Peggy managing the domestic sphere with the practiced efficiency of a woman, accustomed to making ends meet on a modest income. The house itself was a study in functional simplicity. The ground floor consisted of a small entrance hall, a front sitting room, and a kitchen that opened onto the back garden. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms accommodated the family, with the parents occupying the front bedroom, while the children shared the remaining 2 rooms. The interior decoration was practical rather than luxurious, with floral wallpaper, worn carpets, and furniture that prioritized durability over style. For over a decade, the Hodgson family had lived an unremarkable existence within these walls. The children attended the local schools, played with neighborhood friends, and navigated the ordinary challenges of growing up in 1970s Britain. Peggy managed the household with the weary competence of a mother stretched thin by the demands of raising 4 children on a limited budget, while Ronald's presence provided the stability that working-class families of the era both expected and required. The first crack in this facade of normalcy appeared not with supernatural fanfare, but with the quiet devastation of marital breakdown. In early 1977, Ronald Hodgson left the family home, abandoning his wife and children to face an uncertain future alone. The departure was neither dramatic nor unexpected. Rather, it was the culmination of years of gradual disconnection and the inevitable collapse of a relationship that had been sustained more by duty than affection. Peggy found herself suddenly transformed from a housewife to a single mother, A transition that brought with it not only financial hardship, but also the profound psychological burden of sole responsibility for 4 children. The absence of Ronald's income meant that luxuries became impossibilities, and even necessities required careful calculation and sacrifice. The family's social status, already precarious, became even more vulnerable in a society that still viewed single motherhood with suspicion and disapproval. The children, each dealing with their father's abandonment in their own way, began to exhibit the behavioral changes that often accompany family trauma. Margaret, approaching adolescence, became increasingly withdrawn and moody. While the younger boys struggled with anger and confusion they were too young to articulate. Janet, caught between childhood and adolescence, seemed to internalize the family's distress most acutely, her naturally vivacious personality becoming increasingly subdued as the months passed. The house itself seemed to reflect the family's altered circumstances. Without Ronald's presence, rooms that had once felt comfortably full now seemed hollow and echoing. The silence that had once been a welcome respite from the chaos of family life became oppressive, broken only by the muffled sounds of neighbors going about their daily routines and the distant hum of traffic on the nearby main road. It was in this atmosphere of emotional fragility and social isolation that the first signs of something extraordinary began to manifest. The initial disturbances were so subtle as to be almost dismissible, the kind of minor domestic anomalies that might be attributed to settling foundations, temperature changes, or the simple wear and tear of a 40-year-old house. The first incident occurred on the evening of August 30th, 1977, a date that would later be marked as the beginning of what paranormal investigators would term the Enfield Poltergeist outbreak. Peggy was preparing for bed when she heard what sounded like furniture being moved in the children's bedroom above. The scraping noise was distinct and prolonged, as if heavy objects were being dragged across the floor. Assuming that the children were playing rather than settling down for sleep, Peggy climbed the narrow stairs to investigate. She found Margaret and Janet in their shared bedroom, both girls sitting upright in their beds with expressions of confusion and mild alarm. The room appeared normal, with no evidence of furniture having been moved. Yet the sound had been unmistakably real and seemingly emanated from this very space. When questioned, both girls insisted they had not been moving furniture or playing games. Their demeanor suggested genuine bewilderment rather than the sheepish guilt that typically accompanied childhood mischief. Peggy, exhausted by the day's responsibilities and already stretched thin by the challenges of single parenthood, chose to dismiss the incident as a misunderstanding rather than pursue it further. The following evening brought a repetition of the strange sounds, this time accompanied by what Peggy later described as a distinct knocking that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. The rhythm was irregular but insistent, occurring in bursts of 3 or 4 raps before falling silent for several minutes. The sound was neither subtle nor ambiguous. It was clear, purposeful, and entirely inexplicable. This time, Peggy's investigation was more thorough. She checked each room systematically, examining walls, floors, and ceilings for any sign of structural issues that might explain the sounds. She investigated the plumbing, wondering if expanding pipes or settling foundations might be responsible for the disturbances. Yet no rational explanation presented itself, and the knocking continued intermittently throughout the night. The third night brought an escalation that shattered any remaining possibility of rational dismissal. Peggy was awakened by the sound of furniture being moved, not just in one room, but throughout the upper floor of the house. The scraping, dragging, and bumping sounds were accompanied by what could only be described as footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the landing and in and out of the bedrooms, rising from her bed with a mixture of anger and apprehension. Peggy ascended the stairs to confront what she assumed must be her children engaged in an elaborate nighttime game. Instead, she found all 4 children huddled together in the girl's bedroom, their faces pale with fear and confusion. The sounds continued even as she stood among them, the unmistakable noise of furniture being dragged across the floor coming from the very room in which they all stood. It was at this moment that Peggy Hodgson first acknowledged the possibility that something beyond the realm of normal experience was occurring in her home. The recognition came not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual acceptance of the impossible, the way one might slowly acknowledge the reality of a terminal diagnosis or the finality of death. The familiar had become unfamiliar, the safe had become threatening, and the rational world she had inhabited for 47 years had revealed itself to be far more mysterious and unpredictable than she had ever imagined. Chapter 2. The Acceleration. The 4th night marked a transformation in the nature of the disturbances, as if some invisible presence had grown bolder or more frustrated with its previous subtle attempts at communication. What had begun as mysterious sounds evolved into physical manifestations that could neither be ignored nor explained away by conventional logic. Janet Hodgson awoke to find her bed shaking violently, the metal frame rattling against the floor with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. The movement was not the gentle tremor that might be caused by passing traffic or settling foundations, but a vigorous rocking motion that lifted the legs of the bed clear off the ground before slamming them down again with resounding crashes. Margaret, sharing the room with her younger sister, watched in terrified fascination as Janet's bed continued its impossible dance. The sight was so extraordinary that her young mind struggled to process what she was witnessing, oscillating between disbelief and terror as the physical evidence of the supernatural unfolded before her eyes. The bed's movement continued for nearly 10 minutes before gradually subsiding, leaving Janet pale and shaken but physically unharmed. The experience had been so intense and undeniable that both girls immediately ran to their mother's room, their urgent whispers and tear-stained faces conveying the severity of what had occurred. Peggy's initial response was skeptical disbelief, the natural reaction of a pragmatic woman confronted with her children's claims of supernatural activity. However, her skepticism evaporated when she entered the girl's bedroom and observed the evidence herself. The bed had moved several inches from its original position, and the carpet beneath showed clear indentations where the metal legs had repeatedly struck the floor. More disturbing still were the marks on the wall beside Janet's bed, a series of scratches and scuffs that had not been present the previous day. The marks appeared to have been made by something hard and sharp, gouged into the wallpaper and underlying plaster with considerable force. Their pattern was random and chaotic, lacking the deliberate artistry that might suggest human creation. Yet their depth and extent indicated a level of violence that was deeply unsettling. The following days brought an escalation in both the frequency and intensity of the phenomena. Objects began to move without apparent cause, starting with small items, but gradually progressing to larger and heavier pieces of furniture. A jewelry box that had belonged to Peggy's grandmother was found in the center of the kitchen floor. Despite having been securely placed on the bedroom dresser the previous evening, the box was undamaged but had been opened, its contents scattered in a precise circle around it. Children's toys began to relocate themselves with increasing regularity. Dolls that had been left in the sitting room would appear in the kitchen. often arranged in unusual positions that suggested deliberate placement rather than random movement. Building blocks would be found stacked in impossible configurations, balanced in ways that defied the laws of physics and engineering. The most unsettling incidents involved the movement of furniture. Chairs would be discovered overturned in the middle of the night, their legs pointing skyward in positions that suggested they had been flipped with considerable force. The kitchen table, a heavy wooden piece that required significant effort to move under normal circumstances, was found, pushed against the wall on several occasions, despite no one in the family having any recollection of moving it. These physical manifestations were accompanied by an increase in the mysterious sounds that had first alerted Peggy to the presence of something unusual in her home. The knocking had evolved into a complex pattern of raps, taps, and scraping sounds that seemed to emanate from every surface in the house. The sounds were not random, but appeared to follow some kind of logic or purpose, as if an invisible entity was attempting to communicate through a primitive form of percussion. The family's sleep patterns became increasingly disrupted as the phenomena intensified. The children, already traumatized by their father's departure, found themselves unable to rest peacefully in their own beds. They would huddle together in one room, seeking comfort in shared vigilance, but even this strategy proved inadequate. As the disturbances seemed to follow them wherever they sought refuge, Peggy found herself caught between her maternal instinct to protect her children and her growing sense of helplessness in the face of forces she could neither understand nor control. The rational part of her mind continued to search for logical explanations, examining every possibility from structural problems to elaborate pranks, yet the evidence of her own senses made such explanations increasingly untenable. The impact on the family's daily life became profound and far-reaching. The children's performance at school began to deteriorate as exhaustion and stress took their toll. Teachers noticed their increasing inattention and emotional fragility, but the family's attempts to explain their home situation were met with polite skepticism and thinly veiled suggestions that professional help might be advisable. Peggy's own psychological state began to show signs of strain. The constant vigilance required to monitor the supernatural activity in her home, combined with the ongoing challenges of single parenthood, created a burden that tested the limits of her emotional resilience. She found herself questioning her own sanity, wondering whether the stress of her circumstances had somehow caused her to imagine or misinterpret normal household occurrences. Yet the physical evidence continued to accumulate, making denial increasingly difficult to maintain. Neighbors began to notice unusual sounds emanating from the Hodgson house, particularly during the evening hours when the disturbances seemed most active. The thin walls of the council house provided little insulation against the sounds of furniture being moved, objects falling, and the strange knocking that had become a nightly occurrence. Mrs. Nottingham, who lived in the adjacent property, was the first neighbor to approach Peggy with concerns about the noises. Her inquiry was tactful but pointed, motivated by genuine concern for the family's welfare rather than mere curiosity. The conversation that followed marked the first time Peggy had attempted to describe the extraordinary events occurring in her home to someone outside the family circle. The act of verbally articulating the phenomena proved both therapeutic and terrifying. Speaking the words aloud gave them a weight and reality that silent observation had somehow lacked, while simultaneously exposing Peggy to the possibility of ridicule or disbelief. Mrs. Nottingham's reaction was a mixture of concern and skepticism. The polite uncertainty of a well-meaning neighbor confronted with claims that challenged her understanding of reality. As autumn deepened and the phenomena continued to intensify, Peggy realized that her family's situation had moved beyond the realm of private crisis into something that would require external intervention. The question that plagued her was not whether to seek help, but from whom such help might be obtained, and whether anyone would believe their increasingly extraordinary story. The decision to reach out for assistance would prove to be a turning point, transforming a private family crisis into a public spectacle that would attract attention from researchers, journalists, and curiosity seekers from around the world. Yet at this moment, sitting in her kitchen while the sounds of otherworldly activity echoed from the rooms above, Peggy Hodgson was simply a frightened mother seeking protection for her children against forces she could neither understand nor control. Chapter 3. The Witnesses, the transformation of the Enfield Poltergeist. From a private family crisis to a matter of public interest began with a single telephone call made in desperation on the evening of September 12, 1977. Peggy Hodgson, driven to the edge of her emotional endurance by weeks of inexplicable phenomena, finally picked up the receiver and dialed the number for the local police station. The call was logged at 9:47 p.m., recorded in the duty sergeant's log as a domestic disturbance of unknown origin. Peggy's voice, according to the official report, was strained but coherent as she described the ongoing supernatural activity in her home. She was careful to emphasize that she was not reporting a break-in or any form of criminal activity, but rather seeking assistance with what she could only describe as poltergeist activity. The response from the Metropolitan Police was both professional and skeptical. Constable Caroline Heaps, a young officer with less than 2 years of service, was dispatched to investigate the complaint. Her assignment was routine, the kind of minor domestic call that occupied much of a patrol officer's time in suburban London. She arrived at 284 Green Street, expecting to find a family in distress, possibly dealing with domestic violence or mental health issues disguised as supernatural claims. Constable Heap's subsequent report would become one of the most significant pieces of documented evidence in the entire Enfield case. Her training and professional skepticism made her an ideal witness, someone whose testimony would carry weight precisely because she had no prior interest in or belief in paranormal phenomena. Upon entering the Hodgson home, Constable Heaps immediately noticed the atmosphere of tension and fear that pervaded the small council house. The children were clustered together in the sitting room, their faces pale and drawn with exhaustion. Peggy appeared haggard and stressed, but her manner was rational and cooperative rather than hysterical or delusional. The initial interview revealed nothing that would have been considered extraordinary by police standards. The family's account of moving furniture, mysterious sounds, and objects appearing in unexpected locations could easily have been dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations or attention-seeking behavior. However, Constable Heap's opinion changed dramatically when she witnessed the phenomena firsthand. At approximately 10:15 p.m., while the officer was conducting her interview in the sitting room, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. The sound was unmistakably that of something heavy falling or being thrown with considerable force. All 6 people present in the sitting room immediately looked toward the kitchen, and Constable Heaps noted that none of the family members had left the room or could have been responsible for the sound. The investigation of the kitchen revealed that a heavy ceramic vase had been thrown from the top of the refrigerator to the floor, where it lay shattered in the center of the room. The trajectory of the throw was particularly puzzling, as the vase would have had to travel in an arc that defied simple gravitational fall. More significantly, the force of the impact suggested that the vase had been hurled rather than merely dropped. Constable Heaps methodically examined the kitchen for any mechanism that could explain the incident. She checked for hidden strings, examined the stability of the refrigerator, and looked for any evidence of human intervention. Her search revealed nothing that could account for the vase's movement, and her professional training prevented her from accepting supernatural explanations readily. The officer's skepticism was further challenged when, at 10:32 p.m., she personally witnessed a chair in the sitting room rock back and forth without any apparent cause. The movement was gentle but persistent, continuing for nearly 3 minutes while she observed it from multiple angles. The chair was a heavy wooden piece that would have required significant force to move under normal circumstances. Yet it swayed with the gentle rhythm of a rocking chair despite having no curved runners or mechanical assistance. The most compelling incident occurred at 10:45 p.m. when Constable Heaps observed what she later described as a Lego brick flying across the room and hitting the wall opposite. The trajectory of the toy was witnessed by all present, traveling in a straight line from one side of the room to the other with no visible propulsion. The officer's training in observing and recording evidence made her testimony particularly valuable, as she was able to provide precise details about the object's speed, trajectory, and impact. Constable Heaps remained in the house until nearly midnight, during which time she witnessed several additional incidents of unexplained phenomena. Her official report, filed the following day, was a model of professional objectivity, describing the events she had witnessed without attempting to provide supernatural explanations, while acknowledging that no conventional explanation could account for what she had observed. The police report had immediate and far-reaching consequences. Within the Metropolitan Police Force, the Enfield case became a topic of intense discussion and debate. Senior officers were forced to grapple with the implications of having a serving police constable document apparent paranormal activity, while the rank and file struggled to reconcile their colleagues' testimony with their own understanding of reality. News of the police involvement inevitably reached the local press. Despite the family's initial desire for privacy, the Enfield Gazette, a small local newspaper, published the first article about the case on September 16, 1977. The piece was brief and carefully worded, focusing on the police investigation rather than making any claims about the supernatural nature of the events. However, the story quickly gained momentum as it was picked up by larger publications. The Daily Mail, known for its sensationalist approach to unusual news stories, sent a reporter to interview the Hodgson family on September 18th. The resulting article, published under the headline "The House of Strange Happenings," brought the Enfield case to national attention and marked the beginning of an intense period of media scrutiny. The media attention proved to be a double-edged sword for the Hodgson family. While it brought their extraordinary situation to public notice and potentially provided access to expert assistance, it also subjected them to skepticism, ridicule, and invasion of privacy. Reporters camped outside their house, neighbors were interviewed for their opinions, and the family found themselves thrust into the role of reluctant celebrities in a story they had never chosen to make public. The children, already traumatized by the supernatural events in their home and their father's abandonment, now faced the additional stress of public scrutiny. Photographers sought pictures of the family. Journalists peppered them with questions about their experiences, and curious onlookers began to gather outside their house in hopes of witnessing the phenomena for themselves. Peggy Hodgson found herself in the impossible position of trying to protect her children's privacy, while also seeking the help she desperately needed to address the ongoing supernatural activity. The media attention brought offers of assistance from various sources, but it also attracted the attention of skeptics, debunkers, and curiosity seekers who viewed the family's claims with suspicion and sometimes outright hostility. The most significant consequence of the media coverage was that it brought the case to the attention of the Society for Psychical Research, Britain's oldest and most respected organization dedicated to the scientific investigation of paranormal phenomena. Founded in 1882, the SPR had a long history of investigating alleged supernatural events with scientific rigor and academic credibility. To members of the society, Maurice Grass and Guy Lyon Playfair volunteered to investigate the Enfield case. In late September 1977, their involvement would transform the investigation from a police matter and media curiosity into a serious scientific endeavor that would continue for more than 2 years and produce thousands of pages of documentation. Maurice Gross, a successful businessman and amateur magician, brought a unique combination of skepticism and open-mindedness to the investigation. His background in magic made him particularly skilled at detecting fraud and trickery, while his recent personal experience with unexplained phenomena following his daughter's death in a car accident had made him more open to the possibility of genuine supernatural events. Guy Lyon Playfair, a journalist and author with extensive experience investigating paranormal phenomena in Brazil, provided additional expertise and credibility to the investigation. His work documenting poltergeist cases in South America had given him a deep understanding of the patterns and characteristics of such phenomena, making him well qualified to assess the legitimacy of the Enfield case. The arrival of the SPR investigators marked the beginning of a new phase in the Enfield Poltergeist case, one characterized by systematic documentation, scientific analysis, and increasingly intense supernatural activity. The presence of trained observers with recording equipment and analytical skills would provide the most comprehensive documentation of alleged poltergeist phenomena ever assembled, creating a body of evidence that would be debated by researchers and skeptics for decades to come. Chapter 4. The investigation begins. The first meeting between the Society for Psychical Research, investigators, and the Hodgson family took place on September 5, 1977, in the cramped sitting room of 284 Green Street. Maurice Grass and Guy Lyon Playfair arrived with recording equipment, cameras, and measurement devices, transforming the modest council house into an impromptu laboratory for the study of paranormal phenomena. The investigators' initial assessment was thorough and methodical. They examined every room in the house, paying particular attention to the structural integrity of walls, floors, and ceilings. They tested for electromagnetic anomalies, temperature variations, and acoustic irregularities that might explain the reported phenomena. Their approach was rigorously scientific, designed to eliminate conventional explanations before considering supernatural possibilities. Maurice Grass, despite his recent personal experiences with unexplained phenomena, maintained a healthy skepticism about the Hodgson family's claims. His background in magic and conjuring made him particularly alert to the possibility of deliberate fraud or unconscious self-deception. He carefully observed the family dynamics, noting the emotional stress that pervaded the household and the potential psychological motivations that might lead to fabricated supernatural events. Guy Lyon Playfair brought a different perspective to the investigation. one informed by his extensive research into poltergeist phenomena in Brazil and other parts of the world. His comparative approach allowed him to identify patterns and characteristics that were consistent with genuine poltergeist activity, while also recognizing the cultural and psychological factors that could influence the manifestation and interpretation of such events. The investigators' first night in the house yielded minimal supernatural activity, a common pattern in poltergeist cases where the presence of skeptical observers often seems to inhibit phenomena. However, this initial quiet period proved valuable for establishing baseline measurements and familiarizing themselves with the normal sounds and movements of the 40-year-old house. The breakthrough came on their third night of observation, when both investigators witnessed a series of incidents that challenged their preconceptions about the case. At approximately 11:30 p.m., while conducting interviews with the family in the sitting room, a loud bang echoed from the kitchen. Investigation revealed that a heavy saucepan had fallen from its hanging position to the floor, despite the hook from which it hung showing no signs of weakness or damage. More significantly, at 11:47 p.m., both investigators observed a cushion move across the sofa without any visible cause. The movement was slow and deliberate, the cushion sliding approximately 18 inches along the seat before coming to rest against the arm of the sofa. Neither investigator could identify any mechanism that could account for the movement, and their simultaneous observation eliminated the possibility of misperception or hallucination. The most compelling incident of the evening occurred at 12:15 a.m. when Maurice Grass personally witnessed what he later described as a marble shooting across the sitting room and striking the opposite wall. The marble's trajectory was clearly visible, traveling in a straight line with considerable velocity, despite no apparent propulsion. Gross's immediate examination of the area revealed no catapults, springs, or other devices that could have launched the marble. These initial observations convinced both investigators that genuine anomalous phenomena were occurring in the Hodgson household. However, their scientific training prevented them from immediately accepting supernatural explanations. Instead, they began the painstaking process of documenting every incident, measuring environmental conditions, and searching for patterns that might reveal the underlying cause of the disturbances. The investigators established a systematic protocol for their ongoing research. They divided the house into zones, with each room monitored for specific types of activity. Temperature and humidity were recorded regularly. Electromagnetic readings were taken with sensitive equipment, and audio recordings were made continuously during their observation periods. Cameras were positioned to capture any visual phenomena, while motion detectors were installed to alert them to movement in unoccupied rooms. The family's cooperation was essential to the success of the investigation, but it also presented challenges. The children, already stressed by the supernatural activity and media attention, found the constant presence of investigators and recording equipment additional sources of anxiety. Their natural behavior became increasingly self-conscious, and the investigators had to carefully balance their need for documentation with the family's need for privacy and normalcy. Janet Hodgson emerged as the primary focus of the investigation, as the phenomena seemed to occur most frequently in her presence or proximity. The 11-year-old girl displayed a complex mixture of fear, excitement, and exhaustion as she found herself at the center of increasingly intense supernatural activity. Her emotional state became a crucial factor in the investigators' analysis. As they sought to understand the relationship between psychological stress and poltergeist manifestations, the investigators' documentation during the first month of their involvement was extensive and meticulous. They recorded over 40 separate incidents of unexplained phenomena, ranging from minor object movements to dramatic furniture displacement. Each incident was carefully timed, photographed when possible, and analyzed for conventional explanations, before being classified as genuinely anomalous. The pattern of activity that emerged from this systematic observation was both consistent with established poltergeist research and uniquely characteristic of the Enfield case. The phenomena occurred most frequently during evening hours, with peak activity between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. They were more likely to occur when the family was relaxed or distracted rather than when they were actively watching for supernatural events. The types of phenomena observed fell into several distinct categories. Object displacement was the most common, with items ranging from small toys to heavy furniture found in unexpected locations. These movements often occurred while the objects were under direct observation, eliminating the possibility of human manipulation during periods of inattention. Acoustic phenomena were also prominent, including the characteristic knocking sounds that had first alerted Peggy to the supernatural presence in her home. These sounds varied in intensity and pattern, sometimes occurring in rhythmic sequences that suggested attempts at communication. The investigators noted that the knocking often seemed to respond to direct questions or commands, though the responses were not always consistent or meaningful. More unusual were the incidents of apparent levitation, where objects appeared to float or fly through the air without visible support or propulsion. These events were less frequent but more dramatic than the simple object displacement, and they provided some of the most compelling evidence for genuine, supernatural activity. The investigators also documented environmental anomalies associated with the phenomena. Temperature drops of up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit were recorded in specific areas of the house during periods of high supernatural activity. Electromagnetic readings showed unexplained fluctuations, and sensitive individuals reported feelings of unease or oppression in certain locations as their investigation progressed. Grass and Playfair began to develop theories about the nature and origin of the Enfield phenomena. Their analysis suggested that the activity was consistent with classical poltergeist cases, characterized by the presence of an adolescent focal person, family stress, and environmental factors that might facilitate paranormal manifestations. However, they also recognized unique aspects of the Enfield case that distinguished it from other documented poltergeist outbreaks. The duration and intensity of the phenomena were unusual, as was the apparent intelligence behind many of the manifestations. The investigators began to suspect that they were dealing with something more complex than a simple poltergeist, possibly involving multiple sources of paranormal activity. The investigation also revealed the profound impact that the supernatural events were having on the Hodgson family. The children's sleep patterns were severely disrupted, their academic performance was declining, and their emotional well-being was increasingly fragile. Peggy Hodgson showed signs of chronic stress and exhaustion, struggling to maintain her role as family caretaker while dealing with forces beyond her understanding or control. The investigators recognized that their role extended beyond mere documentation of paranormal phenomena to include support and assistance for a family in crisis. They began to function as informal counselors and advocates, helping the Hodgsons navigate the challenges of media attention, skeptical criticism, and the ongoing supernatural activity in their home. This dual role of scientific observer and family supporter would create ethical and methodological challenges as the investigation continued. The need to maintain objectivity while providing emotional support to traumatized children would test the investigators' professional boundaries and personal convictions in ways they had never anticipated. Chapter 5. The Voice the Most Extraordinary. Development in the Enfield Poltergeist case occurred in December 1977, when Janet Hodgson began to exhibit a phenomenon that would transform the investigation from a study of physical manifestations into an exploration of alleged spirit communication. The emergence of what became known as the Voice marked a new and more disturbing phase in the supernatural activity plaguing the Hodgson household. The first indication that something new was developing came through changes in Janet's behavior and physical condition. The 11-year-old girl, already showing signs of strain from months of supernatural activity, began to experience what appeared to be seizures or trance-like states. These episodes would begin with Janet becoming unusually quiet and withdrawn, her eyes taking on a distant, unfocused quality that her mother found deeply unsettling. During these altered states, Janet's voice would change dramatically, becoming deeper and more guttural than any sound that should have been physically possible for a child of her age and size. The transformation was not gradual but sudden and complete, as if her vocal cords had been replaced by those of an adult male. The voice that emerged was rough, harsh, and filled with what could only be described as malevolent intelligence. Maurice Grass was present during one of the first manifestations of the voice phenomenon, and his immediate reaction was one of professional skepticism mixed with genuine alarm. His background in magic had taught him various methods of voice throwing and vocal manipulation, but what he observed with Janet appeared to transcend any technique he had encountered. The voice seemed to emanate from deep within the child's chest, creating a resonance that was both physically and psychologically disturbing. The entity speaking through Janet's voice claimed to be the spirit of Bill Wilkins, an elderly man who had died in the house many years before the Hodgson family had moved in. According to the voice, Wilkins had lived in the house for over 50 years before dying in the sitting room chair, and his spirit had remained trapped within the walls, unable to find peace or move on to whatever lay beyond death. The investigators' initial response to this development was one of intense scrutiny and skepticism. The emergence of an alleged spirit communication dramatically increased the stakes of their investigation, as it moved beyond the relatively straightforward documentation of physical phenomena into the far more controversial realm of mediumship and spirit contact. They recognized that the voice phenomenon would be much more difficult to validate scientifically and would inevitably attract greater skepticism from the scientific community. Guy Lyon Playfair, with his extensive experience in Brazilian paranormal research, was familiar with cases involving apparent spirit communication through children and adolescents. His cross-cultural perspective allowed him to recognize patterns that were consistent with similar phenomena documented in other parts of the world, while also acknowledging the cultural specificity of how such manifestations expressed themselves. The voice of Bill Wilkins was not a pleasant or comforting presence. The entity expressed anger and resentment about the Hodgson family's presence in what he considered to be his house, and he seemed determined to drive them away through increasingly aggressive supernatural activity. The language used was often crude and threatening, filled with obscenities and violent imagery that was shocking coming from the mouth of an 11-year-old girl. The investigators were particularly concerned about the psychological impact of these episodes on Janet herself. When the voice was speaking through her, the child appeared to be in a dissociative state, with no apparent awareness of what was being said or done. Upon returning to normal consciousness, she would have no memory of the communications and would often be physically exhausted and emotionally distressed. medical consultation became a priority as the voice phenomenon intensified. Dr. John Pierce, a consultant pediatrician at the local hospital, examined Janet extensively and found no physical abnormalities that could account for the dramatic vocal changes. X-rays of her throat and vocal cords revealed normal anatomy for a child of her age, making the production of the deep, masculine voice even more inexplicable from a medical standpoint. The content of the spirit communications provided by the voice of Bill Wilkins was both fascinating and disturbing to the investigators. The entity claimed intimate knowledge of the house's history, describing structural changes that had been made decades before the Hodgson family's residence, and recounting details about previous occupants that proved surprisingly accurate when checked against local records. The voice described the house as it had been in the 1920s and 1930s, when Wilkins claimed to have been in his prime. He spoke of wallpaper patterns that had long since been changed, of furniture arrangements that predated the current occupants, and of neighbors whose names appeared in electoral rolls from 40 years earlier. This detailed historical knowledge was particularly compelling given Janet's age and limited education, making it difficult to explain how she could have acquired such specific information through conventional means. Asterisk, however, the investigators remained cautious about accepting the voice phenomenon at face value. They were aware that children could absorb far more information from their environment than adults typically realized, and they considered the possibility that Janet might have unconsciously gathered historical details from overheard conversations, local gossip, or even discarded documents found in the house. The psychological dynamics surrounding the voice manifestations were complex and troubling. The entity claiming to be Bill Wilkins expressed particular hostility toward adult authority figures, especially men, and seemed to take pleasure in shocking listeners with crude language and violent threats. The investigators noted that these themes might reflect Janet's own psychological state following her father's abandonment and the family's ongoing crisis. Dr. Margaret Henning, a child psychiatrist consulted by the investigators, suggested that the voice phenomenon might represent a form of dissociative disorder triggered by severe trauma and stress. She noted that Janet exhibited many of the classic symptoms of a child struggling to cope with overwhelming circumstances, and she hypothesized that the voice might be a psychological defense mechanism that allowed the girl to express anger and distress that she could not otherwise articulate. Yet even Dr. Henning acknowledged that purely psychological explanations struggled to account for all aspects of the phenomenon. The physical impossibility of Janet producing the masculine voice, combined with the accurate historical information provided by the entity, suggested that something more complex was occurring than simple dissociation or role-playing. The voice phenomenon also had profound effects on the other members of the Hodgson family. The younger children were terrified by the dramatic transformation in their sister's appearance and voice during these episodes, often fleeing to other rooms or neighbors' houses when the manifestations began. Margaret, as the eldest child, felt a particular responsibility to protect her younger siblings, while also trying to understand what was happening to her sister, Peggy. Hodgson found the voice episodes particularly distressing, as they represented a complete loss of her maternal ability to protect and comfort her child. Watching Janet transform into a vehicle for an angry, threatening presence was perhaps more traumatic than all the previous supernatural activity combined. The voice often directed its most venomous comments toward Peggy, blaming her for disturbing the peace of his house, and threatening increasingly severe consequences if the family did not leave. The investigators established protocols for documenting The voice communications, using high-quality recording equipment to capture both the audio content and the physiological changes that accompanied the manifestations. These recordings would later become some of the most controversial pieces of evidence in the entire case, with supporters citing them as proof of genuine spirit communication, while skeptics argued that they demonstrated sophisticated but explainable vocal manipulation. The duration and frequency of the voice episodes varied considerably. Some lasted only a few minutes, while others continued for hours, leaving Janet exhausted and disoriented. The manifestations seemed to be triggered by emotional stress, family conflicts, or sometimes by direct challenges from the investigators, who would ask questions or make demands of the alleged spirit. One particularly significant aspect of the voice phenomenon was its apparent ability to respond to information that Janet could not have known through normal means. The entity would comment on conversations that had taken place in other rooms, describe the activities of people who were not present, and even predict future events with occasionally uncanny accuracy. These demonstrations of apparent extrasensory knowledge provided some of the most compelling evidence for the supernatural nature of the communications. The investigators also noted that the voice exhibited a consistent personality and memory across multiple episodes, maintaining continuity of character and recollection that suggested something more than random psychological dissociation. The entity remembered previous conversations, referred to ongoing issues and conflicts, and demonstrated emotional reactions that seemed genuine and appropriate to the circumstances being discussed. However, inconsistencies in the voice communications provided ammunition for skeptics. The entity sometimes gave contradictory information about its earthly life, failed to answer questions that a real person from the claimed time period should have been able to answer, and occasionally demonstrated knowledge that seemed more contemporary than historical. These discrepancies raised serious questions about the authenticity of the spirit communication claims. The investigators found themselves walking a tightrope between maintaining scientific objectivity and providing appropriate care for a traumatized child. They recognized that their primary responsibility was to Janet's welfare, regardless of the evidential value of the phenomena she was experiencing. This ethical consideration sometimes conflicted with their research objectives, forcing them to make difficult decisions about when to encourage or discourage the manifestations. The voice phenomenon also attracted increased attention from both supporters and critics of the paranormal. Religious leaders from various denominations offered to perform exorcisms or blessing ceremonies, while skeptical researchers proposed elaborate theories about fraud, suggestion, and psychological manipulation. The family found themselves at the center of increasingly heated debates about the nature of consciousness, the possibility of life after death, and the reliability of eyewitness testimony. As winter gave way to spring in 1978, the voice communications became more frequent and more disturbing. The entity claiming to be Bill Wilkins was joined by other alleged spirits, each with their own personality and agenda. This multiplication of voices created additional complexity for the investigators, while placing even greater psychological stress on Janet and her family. The emergence of multiple spirit personalities raised new questions about the nature of the phenomenon. Were these genuinely separate entities, or were they different aspects of Janet's own fractured psyche? The investigators struggled to develop methodologies for distinguishing between authentic spirit communication and sophisticated psychological drama, while also trying to provide appropriate support for a family in crisis. The voice phenomenon transformed the Enfield case from a local curiosity into an international sensation, attracting researchers, journalists, and curiosity seekers from around the world. The implications of genuine after-death communication would be profound for both science and religion, making the stakes of the investigation far higher than anyone had initially anticipated. Chapter 6. The Escalation. By the spring of 1978, the supernatural activity at 284 Green Street had reached levels of intensity that defied both explanation and endurance. What had begun as mysterious sounds and minor object displacement had evolved into a full-scale paranormal assault that seemed designed to drive the Hodgson family from their home through sheer psychological and physical intimidation. The physical manifestations had become increasingly violent and destructive. Kitchen utensils would fly across rooms with sufficient force to embed themselves in walls, leaving behind gouges in the plaster that required professional repair. Heavy furniture moved with such regularity that the family had given up attempting to maintain any consistent room arrangement, instead adapting to the constant rearrangement of their living space by unseen forces. The investigators documented incidents of apparent levitation that challenged the fundamental laws of physics. On March 15, 1978, both Morris Grass and Guy Lyon Playfair observed Janet Hodgson apparently floating 3 feet above her bed for a period of nearly 2 minutes. The levitation occurred in full light with multiple witnesses present, and photographs taken during the incident showed the child suspended in mid-air with no visible means of support. However, this dramatic incident became a source of controversy when skeptics pointed out that the photographs could have been taken during a normal jump or fall, capturing a moment of apparent suspension that was actually part of natural movement. The investigators acknowledged this possibility while maintaining that their direct observation had lasted far longer than any normal jump could account for. The destruction of property had become a constant concern for the family. Windows would shatter without apparent cause, mirrors would crack in complex spiderweb patterns, and electrical appliances would malfunction or break down entirely. The cumulative cost of repairs and replacements was placing additional financial strain on Peggy Hodgson's already stretched budget, adding economic hardship to the family's supernatural ordeal. More disturbing were the incidents of apparent physical assault on family members. Janet reported being pinched, scratched, and pushed by invisible hands, and physical evidence in the form of unexplained marks and bruises supported her claims. The investigators documented these injuries through photographs and medical examination. Though skeptics argued that such marks could be self-inflicted or the result of normal childhood activities, the psychological toll on the family had become severe and unmistakable. The children showed signs of chronic sleep deprivation, anxiety, and depression that were affecting their academic performance and social relationships. School officials expressed concern about the family's situation and suggested that professional counseling might be necessary to address what they perceived as behavioral problems rather than supernatural experiences. Janet's condition was particularly worrying to the investigators and medical professionals involved in the case. The frequency and intensity of her trance states had increased dramatically, and the voice communications had become more threatening and abusive. During these episodes, she would sometimes exhibit knowledge of events occurring in other parts of the house or even in other locations entirely, suggesting some form of extrasensory perception that defied conventional explanation. The entity claiming to be Bill Wilkins had been joined by other alleged spirits, each with distinct personalities and apparent agendas. A second voice, claiming to be that of a young girl who had died in the house decades earlier, spoke in a high, childlike whisper that was somehow even more unsettling than Wilkins' aggressive masculine tones. This multiplicity of voices raised questions about whether Janet was channeling multiple spirits or creating elaborate psychological personas as a coping mechanism. The investigators attempted to establish communication protocols with the alleged spirits, asking specific questions about their earthly lives and deaths in an effort to verify their claimed identities. The responses were often detailed and historically consistent, but they also contained anachronisms and inconsistencies that suggested either deliberate deception or the contamination of genuine spirit communication with contemporary knowledge. Dr. William Roll, a respected parapsychologist from the Psychical Research Foundation in North Carolina, visited the Enfield house in April 1978 to provide independent assessment of the phenomena. His evaluation confirmed many of the investigators' observations, while also raising additional questions about the relationship between poltergeist activity and the psychological state of the focal person. Dr. Roll's analysis suggested that Janet might be unconsciously causing the physical phenomena through a form of psychokinesis triggered by emotional stress and hormonal changes associated with adolescence. This theory could account for the correlation between the girl's emotional state and the intensity of supernatural activity, while also explaining why the phenomena seemed to center around her presence. However, the psychokinesis hypothesis struggled to explain some of the more complex aspects of the case, particularly the voice communications and their demonstration of historical knowledge that Janet should not have possessed. Dr. Roll acknowledged that the Enfield case presented unique challenges to conventional parapsychological theory and might require new models to fully understand the mechanisms involved. The involvement of additional researchers brought both credibility and controversy to the investigation. The presence of academically credentialed scientists lent weight to claims of genuine paranormal activity, but it also attracted more intense scrutiny from skeptical organizations and individual debunkers who were determined to expose what they considered to be elaborate fraud or self-deception. Anita Gregory, a psychology lecturer at the University of London and a member of the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, conducted her own investigation of the Enfield case in May 1978. Her approach was overtly skeptical, focusing on the possibility of conscious or unconscious fraught by the family members and methodological flaws in the investigators' documentation. Dr. Gregory's report, published several months later, claimed that she had observed Janet Hodgson attempting to manipulate objects when she thought she was unobserved, and she argued that the entire case could be explained through a combination of deliberate trickery, suggestion, and wishful thinking on the part of the investigators. Her conclusions were hotly disputed by Grass and Playfair, who argued that her brief observation period and preconceived skepticism had prevented her from witnessing genuine phenomena. The conflict between believers and skeptics became increasingly acrimonious as the case gained international attention. Television crews from Britain, America, and other countries arrived to document the phenomena, but their presence often seemed to inhibit supernatural activity, leading to frustrating sessions where nothing extraordinary occurred despite hours of filming. The media coverage had transformed the Hodgson family from private citizens into reluctant public figures, with all the benefits and drawbacks that such attention entailed. While the publicity brought offers of help from researchers and sympathetic individuals around the world, it also subjected the family to harsh criticism from those who viewed their claims as fraudulent or delusional. Janet, in particular, struggled with the pressure of constant observation and the expectation that she would produce supernatural phenomena on demand for visiting researchers and journalists. The child's natural desire for attention and approval sometimes conflicted with the investigators' need for objective documentation, creating situations where the line between genuine phenomena and performance became increasingly blurred. Investigators found themselves defending not only the authenticity of the phenomena they had observed, but also their own professional credibility and scientific integrity. The extraordinary nature of their claims made them targets for criticism from skeptical colleagues who questioned both their methodology and their objectivity. Maurice Grass, in particular, faced accusations that his recent personal tragedy had made him more susceptible to believing in supernatural explanations for unusual events. Critics argued that his desire to maintain contact with his deceased daughter had compromised his ability to evaluate the Enfield case objectively, a charge that he vigorously denied while acknowledging that his personal experiences had given him greater openness to paranormal possibilities. The investigation had also revealed troubling ethical questions about the responsibilities of researchers studying children who claimed to be experiencing supernatural phenomena. The need to document extraordinary events had to be balanced against the welfare of young people who were clearly under tremendous psychological stress. Regardless of whether that stress was caused by genuine supernatural activity or other factors. As summer approached, the intensity of phenomena at the Enfield house showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, the activity seemed to be escalating in response to the increased attention and investigation. The investigators began to wonder whether their presence and documentation efforts were somehow feeding the phenomena, creating a feedback loop that encouraged greater and more dramatic manifestations. The question of how long the investigation could continue became increasingly urgent as the psychological and physical toll on the family continued to mount. The children's health and development were clearly being affected by the ongoing stress, and there were growing concerns that prolonged exposure to the intense supernatural activity might cause permanent psychological damage. Chapter 7: The Photographs. Visual documentation of the Enfield Poltergeist case would prove to be among the most controversial and debated aspects of the entire investigation. Beginning in the spring of 1978, Graham Morris, a photographer working for the Daily Mail, began capturing images that appeared to show supernatural phenomena in progress, creating a visual record that would be scrutinized, analyzed, and argued. Over 4 decades to come, Maurice approached the assignment with professional skepticism, expecting to document what he assumed would prove to be either deliberate fraud or misinterpreted natural phenomena. His background in newspaper photography had given him extensive experience in detecting staged events and manipulated situations, skills that he believed would serve him well in exposing the truth behind the Hodgson family's extraordinary claims. The photographer's first sessions at the house yielded conventional images of the family and investigators, along with documentation of the physical damage that had allegedly been caused by supernatural activity. The gouges in walls, the displaced furniture, and the scattered debris told a story of considerable disturbance, but they provided no direct evidence of paranormal causation. The breakthrough came during a particularly active evening in late May 1978, when Morris was present with his camera during what witnesses described as one of the most intense episodes of supernatural activity they had observed. The photographer was positioned in the girl's bedroom, camera at the ready, when Janet Hodgson apparently began to levitate from her bed. The resulting photograph, taken with a high-speed flash, showed Janet suspended horizontally in midair, her body parallel to the floor and approximately 4 feet above her bed. Her face showed an expression of apparent surprise or distress, and her nightgown was draped in a manner consistent with being airborne rather than supported by hidden wires or platforms. The image was immediately controversial. Supporters of the paranormal interpretation argued that it provided unprecedented visual evidence of genuine levitation, while skeptics contended that it simply captured a moment during a normal jump or fall. The debate centered on the height and duration of Janet's suspension, with believers claiming it exceeded what could be achieved through natural movement, and critics arguing that the single photograph could not prove sustained levitation. Technical analysis of the photograph revealed no obvious signs of manipulation or fraud. The lighting was consistent throughout the image. There were no visible wires or supports, and the positioning of objects in the room appeared natural and unaltered. However, skeptics pointed out that sophisticated trickery might not leave obvious traces, and they questioned the photographer's claim that the levitation had lasted longer than the instant captured by his camera. Maurice continued his documentation over several months, amassing a collection of images that appeared to show various types of supernatural phenomena. Some photographs captured objects in mid-flight, apparently hurled by invisible forces across rooms. Others showed furniture in impossible positions or configurations that suggested movement by non-physical means. One particularly striking image showed a heavy chair apparently flying through the air in the sitting room, with family members visible in the background displaying expressions of alarm and surprise. The photograph's composition and the positioning of the witnesses suggested that the event had been spontaneous rather than staged, but critics argued that careful choreography could have created the appearance of authenticity. The photographic evidence also documented the physical effects of the alleged supernatural activity on the house itself. Images showed systematic damage to walls, with patterns of scratches, gouges, and holes that appeared too extensive and regular to have been caused by normal wear or deliberate vandalism. The damage seemed to follow the progression of supernatural activity, with new destruction appearing in correlation with reported increases in phenomena. More disturbing were the photographs that appeared to show physical effects on family members themselves. Images of unexplained scratches, bruises, and marks on the children's skin provided visual evidence that supported their claims of physical assault by invisible forces. Medical professionals who examined these photographs noted that the patterns and locations of the injuries were consistent with external causation rather than self-infliction. The documentation of the voice phenomena presented particular challenges for photographic evidence. While the audio recordings captured the extraordinary vocal transformations, the visual record could only show Janet's physical appearance during these episodes. Photographs taken during trance states revealed dramatic changes in the child's facial expression and posture, with her features taking on an adult-like quality that seemed inconsistent with her chronological age. The investigators used multiple cameras and photographers in an attempt to corroborate the visual evidence and eliminate the possibility of fraud by any single individual. When similar phenomena were captured by different photographers using different equipment, it strengthened claims of authenticity while making coordinated deception less likely, though not impossible. High-speed photography was employed to capture rapid movements that might be missed by normal observation. These images revealed details about the trajectory and behavior of flying objects that supported supernatural explanations, while also providing more precise data for skeptical analysis. Frame-by-frame examination of rapid sequences showed object movements that appeared to defy gravitational expectations. The The photographic evidence was subjected to extensive technical analysis by experts in photography, physics, and image manipulation. Computer enhancement techniques, still primitive by modern standards, were used to examine the images for signs of alteration or trickery. While no definitive proof of fraud was discovered, the limitations of 1970s technology meant that sophisticated manipulation techniques might not have been detectable. Professional magicians were consulted to assess whether the phenomena captured in the photographs could have been produced through conjuring techniques or stage magic. Some effects were deemed reproducible through skilled manipulation, while others were considered extremely difficult or impossible to achieve without detection under the observation conditions present during the photography sessions. The publication of the photographs in newspapers and magazines brought the Enfield case to an even wider audience, making the visual evidence accessible to millions of people who could form their own opinions about their authenticity. The images became iconic representations of the paranormal, reproduced in countless books and articles about supernatural phenomena. However, the widespread publication also subjected the photographs to intense scrutiny from amateur and professional skeptics around the world. Every detail was analyzed and debated, with critics identifying what they claimed were signs of fraud or misinterpretation, while supporters defended the images as genuine documentation of extraordinary events. The psychological impact of the photographic documentation on the Hodgson family was significant and complex. Seeing themselves portrayed as subjects of supernatural phenomena in published photographs made their experiences seem more real and validated their claims. But it also intensified their sense of being public spectacles rather than private individuals, dealing with personal crises. Janet, in particular, struggled with her portrayal in the photographs, which often showed her in vulnerable or distressed states during supernatural episodes. The images became permanent records of traumatic experiences, preserved for public consumption and endless analysis long after the events themselves had concluded. The photographic evidence also influenced the behavior of the phenomena themselves, as the presence of cameras and the expectation of visual documentation seemed to affect the nature and frequency of supernatural activity. Some investigators speculated that the entities or forces responsible for the phenomena were aware of being photographed and might be deliberately performing for the cameras. The debate over the authenticity of the Enfield photographs continues to this day, with new generations of analysts applying increasingly sophisticated techniques to examine the images for signs of fraud or manipulation. While definitive proof remains elusive, the photographs continue to represent some of the most compelling visual evidence ever assembled for alleged paranormal activity. The ethical questions surrounding the photography of children experiencing traumatic, supernatural events became increasingly important as the investigation progressed. The need to document extraordinary phenomena had to be balanced against the privacy and dignity of young people who were clearly under tremendous stress, regardless of the ultimate explanation for their experiences. Chapter 8. The Skeptics Challenge. The growing international attention focused on the Enfield Poltergeist case inevitably attracted the scrutiny of professional skeptics and debunkers, individuals and organizations dedicated to exposing what they considered to be fraud, delusion, or misinterpretation masquerading as paranormal phenomena. Their involvement transformed the investigation from a relatively straightforward documentation effort into a complex battleground between competing worldviews and methodologies. The Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, an American organization founded in 1976, took particular interest in the Enfield case as part of their broader mission to apply scientific skepticism to allegedly supernatural events. The committee's approach was uncompromisingly materialist, operating from the premise that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence and that conventional explanations should always be preferred over paranormal ones. James Randi, a professional magician and prominent debunker of psychic claims, traveled to London in June 1978 to investigate the Enfield phenomena personally. His background in stage magic gave him particular expertise in detecting fraud and misdirection, skills that he considered essential for evaluating claims of supernatural activity. Randi's involvement brought significant media attention while also lending credibility to skeptical interpretations of the case. Randi's initial assessment was predictably dismissive. After spending 2 days observing the Hodgson household, he declared that he had witnessed nothing that could not be explained through conventional means. Primarily deliberate fraud perpetrated by the children with the unconscious collusion of credulous investigators. His report, widely published in skeptical publications, characterized the entire case as an elaborate hoax designed to attract attention and possibly financial gain. The magician's critique focused particularly on the apparent levitation incidents, which he claimed could be easily replicated through simple jumping and careful timing of photographs. He demonstrated his theory by having assistants jump from beds while photographers captured images at the peak of their trajectories, creating pictures that resembled those taken of Janet Hodgson's alleged supernatural flights. However, Randi's demonstration was challenged by the original investigators, who pointed out that the skeptic had observed the household for only a brief period during which little supernatural activity had occurred. They argued that his negative findings were meaningless, given the documented tendency for phenomena to diminish in the presence of hostile observers, a pattern consistent with genuine paranormal activity rather than evidence against it. Melvin Harris, a British writer and skeptic, conducted a more extensive investigation of the case, focusing on the historical claims made by the voice allegedly belonging to Bill Wilkins. Harris's research into local records and electoral rolls revealed discrepancies in the entity's account of his earthly life, including inconsistencies in dates, addresses, and family relationships that seemed to undermine claims of authentic spirit communication. Harris's findings were particularly damaging to the credibility of the voice phenomena, as they suggested that the historical information provided by the alleged spirit was neither accurate nor inaccessible to the Hodgson family through conventional research. He argued that Janet could have acquired the general historical knowledge through overheard conversations, local gossip, or even library research, then embellished it with fictional details during her trance states. The skeptical investigation also focused on the psychological dynamics within the Hodgson family, suggesting that the supernatural claims might be understood as responses to severe family stress rather than genuine paranormal activity. The recent departure of the father, financial difficulties, and social pressures were identified as factors that might motivate attention-seeking behavior or psychological dissociation that could masquerade as supernatural phenomena. Dr. Christopher French, a psychologist at the University of London specializing in anomalous experiences, proposed that the Enfield case might represent a form of mass hysteria or shared delusion affecting both the family and their investigators. He suggested that the initial reports of minor disturbances had created an expectation of supernatural activity that led to the misinterpretation of normal events and the unconscious encouragement of attention-seeking behavior by the children. The Skeptical assault on the case was not limited to academic or professional debunkers. Local residents and former neighbors of the Hodgson family came forward with claims that contradicted the investigators' accounts. Some reported that they had observed the children engaging in obvious trickery when they thought they were unobserved, while others suggested that the family had a history of attention-seeking behavior that predated the supernatural claims. These testimonies were particularly damaging because they came from individuals with direct knowledge of the family and no apparent motive for fabrication. However, the investigators questioned the reliability and motivation of these witnesses, suggesting that some might be seeking their own moment of fame or settling personal grudges against the family. The technical analysis of the photographic evidence became a major battleground between believers and skeptics. Professional photographers and image analysts were enlisted by both sides to examine the controversial levitation pictures and other visual documentation. The results were inconclusive, with experts reaching different conclusions based on their initial predispositions and the specific aspects of the images they emphasized in their analysis. Computer analysis of the photographs, primitive by modern standards, but cutting edge for the late 1970s, failed to provide definitive proof either of authenticity or fraud. The limitations of the technology meant that sophisticated trickery might go undetected, while genuine phenomena might not leave the kind of clear evidence that skeptics demanded as proof. The audio recordings of the voice phenomena were subjected to similar scrutiny, with voice analysts and acoustics experts examining the recordings for signs of manipulation or natural explanation. Some specialists concluded that the vocal transformations exceeded what should have been physically possible for a child of Janet's age and size, while others argued that the recordings could have been produced through ventriloquism, voice throwing, or electronic manipulation. The investigation revealed the practical and ethical challenges inherent in studying alleged paranormal phenomena involving children. The presence of skeptical investigators and the constant pressure to produce evidence on demand created an atmosphere that was potentially harmful to young people already under considerable psychological stress. The need to protect the children's welfare sometimes conflicted with the desire to conduct rigorous scientific investigation. The skeptical challenge also revealed methodological weaknesses in the original investigation that compromised its scientific credibility. The investigators' emotional investment in the family's welfare and their prior belief in paranormal phenomena raised questions about their objectivity and their ability to recognize fraud or misinterpretation when it occurred. The controversy surrounding the case was further complicated by the commercial interests that had developed around it. Book deals, media appearances, and lecture tours created financial incentives that might influence the behavior of both investigators and family members, providing motivations for maintaining claims of supernatural activity regardless of their authenticity. The polarization between believers and skeptics became increasingly acrimonious as each side accused the other of bias, incompetence, or deliberate deception. The scientific ideal of objective investigation was compromised by the emotional investment that both camps had developed in proving their respective positions, transforming what should have been a collaborative search for truth into an adversarial competition. The skeptical investigation did succeed in identifying several instances where phenomena could be explained through conventional means or where the evidence was less compelling than originally claimed. These findings forced supporters of the paranormal interpretation to acknowledge that not all reported incidents were necessarily supernatural, even if they maintained that genuine phenomena had occurred alongside explainable events. However, the skeptical challenge also revealed the limitations of pure debunking approaches to anomalous phenomena. The focus on exposing fraud or error sometimes prevented skeptics from engaging seriously with the more puzzling aspects of the case, while their predetermined conclusions about the impossibility of paranormal activity made them less likely to recognize genuine anomalies when they encountered them. The confrontation between believers and skeptics in the Enfield case illustrated the broader challenges facing any scientific investigation of alleged paranormal phenomena. The extraordinary nature of such claims inevitably attracts both credulous acceptance and reflexive rejection, making objective evaluation extremely difficult and often impossible to achieve. Chapter 9: The Decline. By the autumn of 1979, nearly 2 years after the first mysterious sounds had disturbed the peace of 284 Green Street, the intensity of paranormal activity in the Hodgson household began to show signs of gradual decline. The phenomenon that had consumed the family's life and attracted international attention was slowly losing its grip on their daily existence. Though the process was neither linear nor predictable, the decrease in supernatural activity was not immediately apparent to those involved in the case. After months of constant vigilance and documentation, the investigators had become accustomed to dramatic daily incidents, making it difficult to recognize that the frequency and intensity of phenomena were diminishing. The change became evident only through retrospective analysis of their detailed records, which showed a clear pattern of declining activity over the final months of 1979. Several factors seemed to contribute to the gradual cessation of the paranormal events. Janet Hodgson, who had been the focal point of much of the activity, was entering her teenage years and experiencing the physical and emotional changes associated with adolescence. Some researchers suggested that the hormonal and psychological transitions of puberty might have altered whatever conditions had made her susceptible to poltergeist phenomena. The family dynamics were also evolving in ways that might have affected the supernatural activity. The initial crisis triggered by Ronald Hodgson's departure had been partially resolved through adaptation and the passage of time. Peggy had developed greater confidence in her role as a single mother. The children had adjusted to their father's absence, and the household had achieved a new equilibrium that was less chaotic and stressful than the early months of the outbreak. Constant presence of investigators and media attention had also taken its toll on the phenomena themselves. The spontaneous, unpredictable nature of early incidents had given way to increasingly self-conscious performances as the family became aware of being constantly observed and documented. The line between genuine supernatural events and unconscious or deliberate theatrical display had become increasingly blurred. Janet's relationship with the alleged spirit of Bill Wilkins had evolved in complex ways throughout the investigation. The initially hostile and threatening communications had gradually become more conversational and less aggressive, as if the entity had become accustomed to the family's presence or had found other ways to express its concerns. Some sessions featured what seemed to be genuine attempts at constructive communication rather than intimidation. However, this apparent mellowing of the spirit's attitude was accompanied by increasing inconsistencies in the information provided during trance communications. The entity began to contradict its earlier statements about its earthly life and death, provided anachronistic references that suggested contemporary rather than historical knowledge, and sometimes seemed confused about basic facts that it should have known if it were genuine. These inconsistencies provided additional ammunition for skeptics while troubling even supportive researchers. Maurice Grass and Guy Lyon Playfair found themselves questioning aspects of the case that they had previously accepted as authentic. though they maintained that genuine phenomena had occurred alongside whatever psychological or fraudulent elements might have developed over time. The investigators also began to notice changes in Janet's behavior and personality that suggested the long ordeal was taking a significant psychological toll. The girl who had been vivacious and outgoing before the outbreak had become withdrawn and moody, displaying signs of depression and anxiety that persisted even during periods when supernatural activity was minimal. Medical and psychological consultations revealed that Janet was suffering from chronic stress and sleep deprivation that threatened her physical and emotional development. The constant scrutiny, the pressure to produce phenomena for investigators and journalists, and the disruption of normal childhood activities had created a situation that mental health professionals deemed potentially harmful to her long-term well-being. The recognition that the investigation itself might be contributing to Janet's psychological distress created an ethical crisis for the researchers. Their scientific interest in documenting paranormal phenomena came into direct conflict with their responsibility to protect the welfare of a vulnerable child, forcing them to reconsider the priorities and methods of their investigation. The declining interests of the media also affected the dynamics of the case. As the novelty of the story wore off and competing news events captured public attention, the constant stream of journalists and photographers that had characterized the height of the outbreak dwindled to occasional visits. The reduced external attention seemed to correlate with decreased supernatural activity, suggesting a possible connection between public interest and paranormal manifestations. The financial pressures on the Hodgson family had also evolved in ways that affected their situation. While media appearances and book deals had provided some income, the costs associated with property damage, medical consultations, and the disruption of normal employment had created ongoing economic challenges. The family's dependence on the investigators and media, representatives for both financial and emotional support, had created relationships that were difficult to maintain as interest in the case declined. The voice phenomena, which had been among the most compelling aspects of the case, became increasingly sporadic and less convincing during the final months of activity. The alleged spirit communications occurred less frequently and with less dramatic vocal transformations, leading some observers to suggest that Janet's growing sophistication and self-awareness were making it more difficult for her to enter the dissociative states that had characterized earlier episodes. The physical phenomena also showed signs of decline, with fewer incidents of object movement, furniture displacement, and apparent levitation. When such events did occur, they were often less dramatic and more easily explained through conventional means than the extraordinary incidents that had characterized the peak period of activity. The investigators began to prepare for the eventual conclusion of their documentation efforts, recognizing that the case was entering its final phase. Their extensive records included thousands of hours of audio recordings, hundreds of photographs, detailed witness statements, and comprehensive analyses of environmental conditions throughout the outbreak period. This documentation would become the foundation for ongoing research and debate long after the phenomena themselves had ceased. The process of analyzing and interpreting the accumulated evidence proved to be as challenging as the original investigation. The sheer volume of material made comprehensive analysis difficult, while the mixed nature of the phenomena, with apparently genuine supernatural events occurring alongside questionable or explicable incidents, complicated any attempt to reach definitive conclusions about the case's authenticity. The investigators also faced the challenge of presenting their findings to both scientific and popular audiences in ways that would be credible and meaningful. The extraordinary nature of their claims required extraordinary evidence. Yet the messy, complex reality of the case defied simple categorization as either purely genuine or purely fraudulent. The impact of the investigation on the researchers themselves had been profound and lasting. Morris Grass, who had begun the investigation as a successful businessman with amateur interests in the paranormal, found himself transformed into a full-time researcher whose life had been fundamentally altered by his experiences at Enfield. His relationship with his own family had been strained by the time and emotional energy he had invested in the case. Guy Lyon Playfair had brought extensive experience with paranormal phenomena to the investigation, but even his broad background had not prepared him for the intensity and complexity of the Enfield case. His involvement had reinforced his belief in the reality of paranormal phenomena, while also teaching him important lessons about the challenges of scientific investigation. In this controversial field, uns might find themselves invited to dine in the Great Hall. The trapdoor, which had previously been used perhaps once or twice per month, now opened with terrifying regularity as Thaddeus sought to eliminate all potential challenges to his authority. The first victim of this new reign of terror was Connor McBride, the brother of the man who had triggered the chapel massacre with his warning about hidden weapons. Connor had approached Thaddeus privately to suggest that perhaps the time had come to seek terms with Tige, arguing that the continued bloodshed was weakening the clan and making it vulnerable to external enemies. His reasonable words were interpreted as evidence of treachery, and he was invited to a private dinner with his lord. Connor arrived at the appointed hour, dressed in his finest clothes and prepared to present his arguments for peace with all the eloquence he could muster. He was welcomed warmly by Thaddeus, who spoke at length about the bonds of loyalty that united their families and the trust that existed between warrior and lord. The conversation continued over several courses of food and multiple cups of wine, lulling Connor into a sense of security that made the betrayal that followed all the more shocking. The signal came as Connor was raising his cup in a toast to his lord's health. The trapdoor opened beneath his feet with mechanical precision, and he plummeted into the darkness below with barely time for a single truncated scream. His body struck the accumulated bones with a sound like breaking pottery, and then there was only silence from the chamber below. Thaddeus closed the trapdoor and continued his meal as if nothing had happened. But those servants who had witnessed the scene reported that his hands shook as he lifted his wine cup and that he spoke to himself in whispers throughout the remainder of the evening. The removal of Connor had eliminated one voice calling for peace, but it had also demonstrated to all within the castle that no one was safe from their lord's paranoia and brutality. The disappearances continued with increasing frequency as Thaddeus' grip on reality began to slip. Old women who had served his family faithfully for decades vanished after making comments about the need for Christian forgiveness. Young men who had trained beside him in the arts of war were consigned to darkness after expressing doubts about the wisdom of continued conflict. Even children were not safe, as Thaddeus became convinced that they might carry messages between the adult members of rival factions. Each use of the oubliette made the next use easier, as if the act of murder was becoming habitual rather than exceptional. The Great Hall, which had once been a place of celebration and fellowship, became a chamber of terror where every invitation to dine carried the possibility of death. Servants assigned to prepare meals for guests would weep as they worked, knowing that they might be preparing the last food that some innocent person would ever taste. But Thaddeus was not the only brother to employ the oubliette. During this period of madness, Tige, though more subtle in his methods, also recognized the utility of an execution system that left no witnesses and no evidence. His victims were chosen with greater care than his brothers, selected for their strategic importance, rather than their immediate threat to his person. Leaders of rival factions, potential witnesses to his own crimes, and anyone who possessed information that might be used against him found themselves guests at intimate dinners that ended in darkness and despair. The oubliette began to change, as it filled with an ever-increasing number of victims. The chamber that had once echoed with the solitary cries of individual prisoners now resonated with a chorus of despair as dozens of people found themselves trapped in the living tomb simultaneously. The air grew even more foul as decomposing bodies created an atmosphere that was barely breathable. The floor rose higher as more bones were added to the charnel heap, gradually reducing the already limited space available to the living.